You've argued that predictive models aren't really useful for marketers because they only tell us what is likely to happen if we don't change anything. Instead, marketers need to graduate to causal levers.
I mean, I've been obsessed with this problem for the last 10 years. I think marketing is ripe and open to counterfactual and causal thinking. And it does lead a little bit to the realization that, predictive models may be an input to something, right? But it's an intermediate step. If I say this person has this kind of churn likelihood, what does it do for me, right? I need to understand what reduces the churn causally, right? So yeah, sure, I can take this prediction, segment it, and then run an experimentation program on top of it. And I think there is better answers now, and I think we'll get into that. Correlation does not address the jobs to be done by the marketer, which ultimately is all about a causal language.
What's up, everyone? Today we have the pleasure of chatting with Tobias Konitzer, VP of AI at Growth Loop. Tobi holds a PhD from Stanford. He also founded 2 AI startups. In this episode, we cover why predictive models fail without causal inference, why dynamic allocation works better than fixed horizon A/B testing, the Boomerang effect, and why Uninformed AI sabotages early results, the power of composable decisioning, and how machine decisioning transcends marketing. All that and a bunch more stuff after a quick word from 2 of our awesome partners. This episode is brought to you by GrowthBench. Is your Martech stack driving you crazy? Like most companies, maybe you have a pile of half-implemented, underutilized tools with no clear stakeholder doing more harm than good, or maybe you don't have the right resource to just get the job done. The GrowthBench Freelance Network is the only place to find vetted, verified, skilled, and US-based talent. Their staffing experts work to understand your needs and match you with candidates quickly and efficiently. They've helped over 1,000 companies tighten up their stack, more revenue, more customers, more often at a lower cost. They support over 300 Martech tools across a range of seniority with flexible term lengths. Need someone to clean up your CDP? Check. Orchestrate journeys in your LCM? Check. Big tool migration? Check. Product analytics? Check. Whether you have a modern stack or something that needs a little more elbow grease, they've got you covered. Visit growthbench.com/humans to talk with one of their freelance staffing specialists.
This episode is brought to you by Revenue Hero.
2 field forms. Complete context, instant scheduling. Finally, you get to pick all 3 without a single line of code. Introducing native enrichment by Revenue Hero. Plug in Clearbit, Crust Data, Apollo, or stack all 3. Enrich all the data you need instantly on submit. Stack your enrichment providers, waterfall your way to clarity. Determine qualification and meeting routing based on enriched information. Layer it onto your current distribution logic. Book more meetings with your qualified buyers. Get started at revenuehero.io.
Tobi, thank you so much for your time today. I'm really excited to chat.
Phil, so much to get into. The disastrous effect of agentic AI, one thing I love to talk about.
The first thing I wanted to ask you about is the prediction trap, if you will. You've argued that predictive models, so a lot of the propensity-based models that companies are using today, aren't really useful for marketers because they only tell us what is likely to happen if we don't change anything, like the current status quo. So we're asking things like who is likely to buy, convert, who is likely to churn. The function is observation, and the outcome is describing the future if we do nothing else. But marketing is all about doing stuff, new channels, new campaigns. So you're saying that instead, marketers need to graduate to causal levers. So instead of asking who's likely to buy, we should be asking how can I make them buy? And instead of saying who is likely to churn, we should be saying how can I prevent someone from churning? So we're changing the function from observation to intervention. And the outcome is like, instead of describing a future if we do nothing, we're trying to describe how to change that future. Do I have that right? Like maybe explain the prediction trap as you see it and why a highly accurate observation of a customer's current trajectory is way different than having the causal levers to actually influence that trajectory.
Yeah, I think first of all, Phil, that's very well put. I mean, I've been obsessed with this problem for the last 10 years, and it's actually part of my trajectory a little bit as well. Before joining Growth Loop, I was CEO of a prediction company that did customer lifetime value predictions, and it did it very accurately, and it did it, with deep learning and taking user level information proprietary data, event stream data, all this kind of stuff to get prediction accuracy to the new level. And I was fairly new to the field of marketing. And we sold into D2C commerce marketers, right? And I remember that we had an easy time selling because we could prove that our LTV predictions were very accurate, right? But I remember sitting there with particularly the lifecycle side with marketers that asked really good questions like, what do we actually do with LTV predictions? Do we target, do we target high LTV customers more? Do we give them more expensive products? Do we give them a discount? And we didn't have an answer to that because the nature of predictive models is, as you said, it represents the status quo, right? What will be this customer's trajectory if nothing changes, right? And quickly realize that obviously the world of marketing is a causal world, as you said, right? Like that is the job of lifecycle marketers. If I change X, what is the outcome in Y, right? How can I maximize Y? Otherwise, there is really no point for marketing. If everything is status quo and forecasting on status quo, and that's the extent of it, right? There is no marketing role here,
right?
And I think we'll get there, but this is not limited to marketing. I would say now where I'm now, I don't understand, for example, in grad school, why I was not obsessed with outcomes-based thinking and reinforcement learning. Why did I even waste so much of my energy on prediction problems? Right? It's I'll tell you that my wife, for example, works in diagnostics in healthcare or health tech, and it's the same problem there, right? You can predict that this is representative of a certain cancer. You can do early detection, but the real question is what intervention moves the needle, right? And I actually think the interesting thing about marketing is that I think marketers, first of all, they have a really hard job. And second of all, I think I think marketing is ripe for this. I think marketers get it, right? I think marketers understand that correlation-based, and we should get a couple of examples, but correlation-based thinking really doesn't move the needle in a meaningful way. I think the other thing that I've discovered is that boardrooms start to care too. Boardrooms start to ask much more causal questions, right? Framed in terms of ROI, but it's ultimately a causal question, which is, what did the intervention cause when it comes to the top line? So I think there is this trajectory change of marketing as a field. I think marketing is ripe and open to counterfactual and causal thinking, and it does. Coming back to your entry point, it does lead a little bit to the realization that predictive models may be an input to something, right? But it's an intermediate step. There is no point. And again, let's go to marketing. I'll give you one example, and I'll turn it back over to you, right? If I say this person has this kind of churn likelihood, right? What does it do for me, right? I need to understand what reduces the churn causally. Right? So yeah, sure, I can take this prediction, segment it, and then run an experimentation program on top of it, which ultimately, back to my days at Audit, which is the name of that company that I founded, that was our answer. And I think there is better answers now, and I think we'll get into that deal. But that I think is what we mean by correlation, or what I mean by correlation does not address the jobs to be done by the marketer, which ultimately is all about a causal language.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe we can use LTV as an example to kind of unpack this. I feel like LTV is really close to your heart, and you were really deep in that space. It's often like the gold standard when marketers are thinking of outcomes for experiments or like a research design. Maybe do you have an example with LTV where like correlative impact on LTV was dressed up as like causal returns? Like how can we think about that?
Yeah, I do think it's a good example, and I'll give you two. So one, it's just kind of interesting. I said that there is this step change in thinking. It's also true that 6 months ago I had a conversation with a head of CRM or lifecycle marketing of $1 billion outdoor brand, And essentially, we ask, or I ask, what do you do when you know that somebody is predicted to be high LTV? What do you do with that customer segment? And for him, the answer was obvious. He said, what do you mean? We're going to spend more money on that segment. That's obvious, right? And it was sort of that was still the old way of thinking, right? It was if you want to be technical, it was the wrong answer. So, but what does it mean? So, let's give a specific example. Let's say all customers that are high LTV have looked at a certain product in the, maybe as an entry point, looked at jeans, right? A certain style of jeans, right? So now you say, okay, well, everybody who is high LTV has looked at this product in the welcome flow, for example. Let's kind of make this the mandatory option in the welcome flow, right? Will this causally increase LTV? You don't know, right? It is not a causal statement. It has there could be all kinds of reasons. Maybe it is true that the ad that you sent to Facebook advertised this, and that segment was a wealthier segment for all you care about, right? Which we call spurious correlation, right? It's associative, yes, there is a relationship there, but now the key causal question is, if you tune that lever, right, will you get an outcome? And the answer, causal outcome. And the answer to that is you don't know.
Yeah, it's a really good example there. Like when I think back of my earlier days in propensity modeling, like the first time I discovered this was my short stint at WordPress.com. We had big company, full data team that was servicing and helping the marketing team, and they had built a homegrown ML propensity model that was attached to our CDP, homegrown CDP, and like we could try to predict the likelihood that a certain segment of users would churn or would like convert or would graduate from a free plan to a paid plan. And I feel like a lot of teams within the company were obsessing about uncertainty, or like how accurate is that prediction going to be if I want to like do this after. And like you said, the focus wasn't on like, what is the thing that I want to do to like make that outcome change. And maybe you can chat about like the role of uncertainty here, because like I said, most teams are like tightening uncertainty around those predictions and labels. And if we're going to rely on the model and this user is going to churn, like we need to be at least 90% or 95% confident in that prediction. Like we're all focused on guessing that future user's state. But you write a lot about how the goal should be reducing uncertainty around the outcome of the intervention, like we just talked about, not trying to guess that user's state, because like, what do we do with that information? So in other words, like instead of focusing on how confident we are that this user is going to churn, we should be focusing on how confident we are that this intervention, this new campaign, this new email, this new message will prevent this user from churning. How does focusing on the estimated effect of our action, like changing a channel or a new offer, make marketing more predictable? Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, sure. And I'll start by saying something that I said before, which is marketing is not an enviable job, right? It's a hard job. Like what we're talking about is, I think if you want to be a good marketer, you have to understand the fundamental problem of causal inference, which is ultimately what we're talking about here, right? What happens to customer X with that intervention or exposed to that intervention? And what happens to customer X if he hadn't been exposed to that intervention, right? That is an unanswerable question at the end of the day. Now, to your question, when it comes to uncertainty, I think this all relates to predictive models being maybe an intermediate step that is fine towards the end goal, right? So you could say something like, and we did this many times. So you could say something like, I can build associative traits that are associated with higher LTV, and I can build hypotheses from there, the causal result of which then I need to test through A/B testing, right? So that's fine. But now imagine kind of the role of uncertainty, right? If you kind of think about uncertainty for all these different steps. So now I have my predictive model that maybe generates these associative traits of LTV, right? That has uncertainty with it, like any model, right? Now you're essentially talking about again, I think that's maybe not a clean model, but how do you translate associations into testable hypotheses, right? That is I'd say that's a statistical model, right? It has uncertainty in it, right? Then the next question is, what is the uncertainty around the tests that you're doing, the A/B testing, right? It has uncertainty to it. All that uncertainty compounds, and that's my issue with kind of treating these things as end goals in themselves, right? We clearly said that they're not, they shouldn't be, they can't be, because it's not what marketers are here to do. It's not the jobs to be done by the marketer, right? But the other issue is if you think that way, then you have a couple of unrelated steps. Each of them come with uncertainty. That uncertainty compounds, right? As opposed to if you have an outcomes-based thinking and you could say, really all I care about, I want to move X, what happens to Y, right? I don't care about anything else. That's all I care about as a marketer, right? Let me try to actually distill all my uncertainty into that outcomes-based model. That is easier said than done, but I think it maybe shows why the sort of focus on predictive accuracy of this step one, and in general, the focus on predictive models can lead to problems down the road because uncertainty will get out of hand, right?
Yeah, so you mentioned A/B testing as a way to validate that. So it's not just correlative. We know for sure if this intervention is actually going to affect the outcome in this cohort of people that we're predicting might churn or not. You've talked about dynamic allocation when it comes to experimentation as a better way than just doing the standard A/B test. I was trying to figure out what are other terms to call dynamic allocation. I've seen some folks call this adaptive experimentation, but it's all a bucket of reinforcement learning or contextual Bayesian armed bandits. I've also seen folks these are all terms data folks are super familiar with. I think a lot of marketers right now are hearing you say Bayesian bandits, and they're like, what the heck are you talking about, Toby? Can you walk us through bandits and dynamic allocation? These are specific types of reinforcement learning, right?
Yes, that's right. And now we're kind of at the heart of decisioning science, which is a really interesting conundrum. Back in the day, what you did, and this was also, I think, the gold standard of the internet age, right? You A/B tested, you found a winner, and you scaled the winner, right? And obviously, internet companies, first of all, are amenable to that world because there is this immediate feedback loop of data.
Right.
I mean, again, we're going to talk about marketing here. One of the things that's so cool about marketing is that, which also makes a marketer's job even less enviable, unfortunately, there's all the data at your fingertips, right? There is so much data, and it's just not equivalent to other fields, right? In medicine, you can't A/B test, doesn't work, right? You can't, for ethical reasons, for other reasons, but in most fields, actually, it doesn't work, right? Mm-hmm. You can't just, test one treatment against another on cancer patients and scale the winning treatment, right? So it's sort of interesting. I mean, many fields by definition are more stuck in this correlational world because there is no way to get to that causal world. Marketing is not one of them, right? But to your question, what is the difference between dynamic allocation, and you're right, that is ultimately reinforcement learning, and traditional A/B testing? Well, traditional A/B testing essentially splits the traffic in our world, right, in a random way. So, ultimately, it'll lead to something like 50% will see that intervention, 50% will see that intervention. But the key thing is random assignment. So for every user who flows to the system, the machine flips a coin or you flip a coin, right? And there's all kinds of really great statistical properties that come from this approach, which is now, if you just look at the mean return of each condition, right? That's causal difference, right? That's probabilistically true, right? So if I essentially randomize and I show you, back to our old example, right? I show you the status quo, or I show you this pair of jeans that high LTV customers clicked on before their first purchase, right? And I measure it against LTV. Now that mean difference is causal. Great, right? But you're wasting time or traffic, right? In the inferior condition, will get 50% of traffic allocation, and that there's a real cost to it, right? Like that's the whole trade-off of experimentation. You as a marketer, you say, you know what, I found this great. I am convinced, I figured out that sending handwritten cards to dog owners, if you're like a pet food company or something, like congratulates them for their birthday, dog's birthday, will increase LTV by 15%. Like I'm freaking convinced about this, right? Now you run the experiment, but if you're so convinced about it, remember you're withholding that treatment
Right.
from the other 50%. That's a real bummer. Now, the whole point of dynamic allocation or reinforcement learning is that you could do both things in parallel. So as opposed to you run an experiment for a fixed time frame and then you scale the winner, right? You basically say, okay, well, you start random because all you got, right? But dynamically, as soon as there is some data coming back to the system, you actually pipe more traffic to the condition that is winning, right? Which at the end of the day is more efficient. But there is also a real trade-off here, that's worth noting. We call it exploration versus exploitation, right? These things are traded off of each other, no matter what approach you choose. Now, the interesting thing, and that's why I started with decision science, is if you want to optimize in a metric, which again is the marketer's job, right? And again, the way that I would describe the lifecycle marketing job is you have to optimize LTV. I mean, what else is there, right? Like that's
Right.
what you got. You start with a known customer profile in your CRM or CDP or whatever it is now, and you maximize the squeeze, right? That's your job, right? So ultimately, I think marketing is about optimization. And then there's this really neat paper out there that is, I think it's Gary V. Kaufman et al. Information processing systems, that shows that if you do experimentation first and scale later, so you have a fixed time frame in which you do experimentation and then you scale, you're actually suboptimal. It's much better to do this dynamic allocation, right? So here is a question for you. If that is the case, why do some of the most sophisticated companies in the US do this other approach of fixed time frame experimentation and scale it up? I mean, these companies like Netflix and these companies have a bazillion of PhDs that understand decisioning science much better than I do, and they kind of center on this wrong approach. And that's an interesting question, isn't it? I think it's one of the paradoxes of decisioning science as applied to marketing writ large.
So why is it that happens? Like, is it like I'm listening to you explain it and I get it. Like maybe I can unpack that. Maybe I want to make sure I do get it. So normal A/B test, 50-50 split, randomized split. And we're basically, the trade-off is we're essentially wasting a lot of potential customers on the weaker option while we're waiting for enough data to reach stat sig. Dynamic allocation is shifting more traffic towards whatever is the leading variant, like performing better, but we're still reserving some traffic and we're dynamically assigning that, and we're still learning and avoiding being fooled by randomness. Like that's the part where it's like, I get it, but also how do we explain that? Like A/B test, I feel like is just so standard. Everyone just gets it, 50-50 random, that's it. But in the dynamic side, it's like, yeah, we're not randomly assigning it anymore. We're doing it dynamically, but it's still random and we're still going to hit stat sig. Like, is that the trade-off there? Like, why are some folks still doing regular A/B tests when a lot of people know that there is a better way to do it out there? Is it like explainability versus like what we know is actually better?
It is explainability, but I think in a different way. And by the way, you brought up a really good point that I sort of omitted. Even in dynamic allocation, you essentially say, hey, you want to build some noise into the allocation process so you can explore, right, options that even initially are maybe suboptimal. Right. And this is exactly this trade-off between exploration and exploitation, or I can say it in a different language, right? You can learn and you can optimize, but these things trade off each other, right? So very simple example. Let's say you start this thing and you're like, oh, holy cow, the handwritten note to the dog owners improves LTV by 20%, biggest intervention I've ever come up with. Now I'm going to be CMO of the company very soon, right? So, you put more and more traffic there, right? But the more traffic you put there, the less you learn. So these things do trade off of each other, right? But again, I would make the point that marketing, for most instances, if you're a lifecycle marketer, you're not in the business of measuring results. You're in the business of optimizing. I think there is edge cases to that. If you work with a software vendor, for example, one of my last companies that I was chief innovation officer of was did estimated delivery dates on the product pages, right? Based on supply chain data and all this good stuff, real-time ML, really cool stuff, right? If you sell that into a consumer-facing company, then the role of the consumer-facing company, I think, is to really just measure that, right? You can't optimize anything. But lifecycle marketer writ large, I think the goal is to optimize, right? You want to. Every CMO has this, or every director of CRM or whatever it is, VP Lifecycle Marketing has this written to their North Star, right? Increase LTV by X. We talked about it. That's not controversial, right? So in that case, dynamic allocation is more efficient. And there's a mathematical proof in that paper that I mentioned, right? There is something about explainability here, though, and that's kind of interesting. So if you look at companies like Zalando and Expedia, and I mentioned, these guys tend to do experimentation and scale. And the reason is, that's kind of the psychological aspect of decisioning science, is internal stakeholders, right? Dynamic bandits are harder to explain. So, you basically, your goal is to affect the change. Say you work, again, I don't want to call out specific companies, but let's say you've discovered, that really there is a big benefit in this LTV, in the handwritten note example, right? Like, let's say that test comes back positive, right? You're not done yet. You still need to convince the CMO or whoever it is to actually enact that intervention. It's a net new intervention, right? So you have to have explainability of the process, right? And it just turns out that in boardrooms and at the executive level, that more simple approach of fixed learning and then scaling is just easier explained. So it's almost like, it's a human bias that leads to a suboptimal outcome, right? But if you're the person enacting this, like if you're the PhD who leads decisioning science, right? You're paid to do the change. So your job is to actually convince the stakeholder. And if you do dynamic allocation and you show that all the traffic goes to one side, but the stakeholder shuts you down because it doesn't understand the principles of dynamic allocation or armed bandits, you're nowhere, right? Like, you won, but it did not turn into an actual win. And so, that's one thing that I've been thinking about too, that obviously relates to change management and things like that. But decisioning science, I don't think, just means, how can we make the most optimal decision? It actually also incorporates, how do we make sure that the decision gets implemented company-wide? And that's a psychological aspect. And I think that is why, in many of these companies, we're stuck with a slightly suboptimal approach, which obviously still beats the status quo, right? Oh, again, the handwritten example. If you spare the cost of the control group because you do dynamic allocation and you find there to be a big winner, but then the change is not implemented, right? That's actually a worse outcome than you running the experiment and scaling the winner, right? And then the paper doesn't discuss this because this is beyond mathematics, it's psychology. But I've been obsessed about that too. How where are the limits of decisioning science? And it's not math on global optima only.
Yeah, it's such a cool topic. I feel like there's a whole episode to do on like the change management side of experimentation and how A/B tests are easy to explain. Everyone kind of grasps it because it's been a concept forever. But when we introduce terms like Bayesian bandits, like you start losing folks really quickly. There's probably a whole episode we can do around that. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Knack. I have the amazing pleasure of chatting with some of the greatest minds in marketing operations. But you'd be shocked at how many of them have the same issues when it comes to their campaign creation process. They're dealing with things like scaling, personalization, keeping assets on brand, render testing emails, working in rigid templates, and worst of all, having to hand code emails. But many of the leaders in the space are using Knack to eliminate these headaches. Knack is a no-code email and landing page creation platform that covers initial campaign requests right until the sync to your marketing automation platform. Knack improves the whole campaign creation process by bringing the building, optimization, testing, collaboration, and also translation functions all in a single spot. So you don't have to jump around and coordinate feedback between a bunch of different people or wait on developers for very simple edits. Because at the end of the day, marketing ops folks want to focus on process and efficiency. Marketers want to focus on creativity, and Knack makes sure you get both and then some. Check them out at knack.com. That's KNAK, and tell them we sent you. This episode is brought to you by MoEngage and their new warehouse native CEP, which revolutionizes the way data should be seamlessly fetched, analyzed, and activated. Now you can use MoEngage Cloud Data Sync to sync your warehouse data with MoEngage and use it to segment audiences or personalize messages without any development. Just set and forget. Use MoEngage warehouse segments to create segments on your warehouse data without moving underlying events, properties, or proprietary segmentation logic, and activate them directly on MoEngage. Using warehouse data analytics, brands can also directly generate insights from their warehouse data. Your long search solution for seamless data sync, smarter segmentation, dynamic personalization, and delightful customer experiences ends here. Warehouse native CEP from MoEngage, making it easy, smart, and secure. Learn more at moengage.com. But I did want to let you talk about the boomerang effect related to this. Like there's, a lot of self-learning systems that are plagued by the boomerang effect. You wrote a lot about this. Like they start by assigning random and uninformed treatments. How can these systems, which lack causal priors, if you will, like end up sabotaging big revenue KPIs for weeks and months during this like initial uninformed learning phase before they actually start learning and actually start driving revenue? Like maybe walk us through that.
Yeah, okay, let's do one segue, right? So in your world, now we're in this better world where we do dynamic allocation, right?
Okay.
So that's the world that you're describing. So, and I think that's probably where marketing almost is. Particularly at innovative companies, if you don't have to deal with the organizational width that we just described of behemoth companies, right? So now we're saying, great, we have, again, maybe we bring it back to the example of LTV just to make it a little bit more concrete, right? We have a bunch of different treatment conditions. Like we can send a handwritten note to the dog's birthday. We can send are you a dog owner?
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me what other good things there are. So I'm like as creative as a fridge.
Automated like food deliveries or like treat deliveries, dog walker ads. I don't know.
Love it. Like a dog walker gift certificate, maybe, so you can go, you can take your spouse on a vacation that has been suffering from this dog that you brought into the home. The marriage is on the brink of collapse. Right. So, but there's a bunch of really good ideas, right? Now, we kind of expose the ideas to, and I like your word of reinforcement learning. I mean, the industry now calls it AI decisioning, but that's ultimately what it is, right? It's the system essentially starts random, it listens to the results, and then it allocates traffic dynamically more and more to the winning conditions, right? Here's the problem though. And I'm going to turn this back as a question to you. How did you, actually you chose it for me. So how did you choose the universe of treatments? How did you do that?
Well, for this example, it's just off the cuff, but personal experience, like my own personal bias.
And that's probably how many marketers do something like that, right?
Yeah.
And I don't want to discard this either. I'm not, intuition and institutional knowledge is a thing, right? It's not. I don't want to come here and say there's, but there is a danger here, right? The danger is that 5 strategies that you just told me about actually backfire. Okay, So let's make this more. So you sent me this gift certificate for the dog walker, and I'm gonna say, what the hell? I mean, this guy thinks my marriage is on the brink of collapse because I brought this puppy, but my wife loves this puppy. How assuming is this of this dog food company? That's, I'm never gonna buy there again, right? Problem, right? I mean, the system is going to learn it, of course, right? You're going to allocate less traffic to that condition. But in the meantime, you actually have a lowering of LTV.
Right.
Because I just went to dog food company B that leaves me alone. It doesn't devil in my private life. And I mean, these are silly examples and, hopefully they're funny and maybe they're not funny. But I've seen this many, many times in my career. I've seen this with LTV, right? Many, many times where you forget decisioning or not, forget reinforcement learning or not, but your initial ideas backfire causally, right? So that is one problem. Even if they don't backfire, let's say they're net neutral, right? You're still wasting space, right? And even worse, and that's kind of an interesting question, you're stuck in the treatment suggestions that you made to me, right? How do you explore new things, right? These systems are not well set up to answer this. And this is where, an idea comes in that we've been building towards, and I've been obsessed with for a long time, which is tying, we haven't talked about this. We're going to hopefully talk about agentic AI a little bit. I did it. I said it in my opener, I am probably a skeptic. But one thing that I have been really focused on is how to tie agentic AI to reinforcement learning and decisioning. And so there is this thing that we call CCCG, the Causal Customer Context Graph. And it's an agentic context graph, right? But imagine you had this thing listening to all your experiments that you've ever done, right? It could build, as a semantic layer, it could build previous effects, causal effects of similar interventions. Super hard to do, right? But essentially, let's break it down to our problem. Maybe, and we call it the cold start problem, right? You had to, I don't know if I can curse on this show. You had to invent all these different things. Can I curse on this show?
Yeah, go
You had
for
to
it.
pull them out of right? That's the but the now imagine that there is a system that says, look, we don't know for sure, but we actually have previous causal statements encoded in this graph, and don't send this dog walker thing because it's pretty proximate to something that you ran an experiment on 3 years ago, and our prior is that this is going to backfire, right? So you can condense the space, basically, in something that is more prone to work. Now, here is the problem. If you do this based on correlational data alone, like basically you say to the agent, look at all the warehouse and data, and initialize, give me 10, 15 starting ideas, right? This thing is going to basically be as bad as the whole idea of correlational decisioning. It's just basically going to say, okay, people that like walk their dog often spend more money on food, so we're going to send them a dog. We're going to send them a dog walker gift certificate, right? Still going to backfire, but it's going to base it off of correlational data. Like a fun example is if you, one of the marketing core capacities of audience building, right? If you put agentic AI on audience building and you just ask this thing, give me an audience that causally minimizes churn, it'll give you an audience of highly engaged people that always buy. Why? Because correlationally they never churn, right? But causally it's nonsense. It's probably the worst audience that you can pick, right? So here is this idea of this CCCG. This causal customer context graph, right? If you embed and log the causal context that you have on every one of their customers in the right way, you can avoid some of these things, right? And here's, I think, where it gets really interesting. You could do this across companies that we work with, for example, that you work with as a Martech vendor, right? The old data co-op model, for example, you could say, look, you don't have to, but it's all anonymized data anyways, right? It's basically telemetry data off of experimentation. That's really what we're talking about here, right? You put into this data co-op, that's what they used to, it was a big business model in Silicon Valley 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And you benefit from essentially what everybody else has been testing on already to avoid that boomerang effect, right? And then I think the related pathway, and I'll turn it back over to you, but the related pathway is, and kind of touched on this too, is you get stuck in what we will call local optima or local maxima in these systems as well, and you need a way to get out of these.
Yeah, local maximum is, or local maxima is a really interesting problem, I guess, like, or like one of the downsides of reinforcement learning too. Like when I was like looking through how you were writing about the boomerang effect, like it totally makes sense. Like we have this uninformed learning period as the system is basically starting blind, and we have random initialization. And I immediately thought of like the episode that we did with the chief growth officer at Well Simple last year, Sabotages. He like called out local maxima as like one of the most important things that marketers need to understand. And I could see it cleanly in that boomerang effect, because like we have this in this random initialization period, like the system is basically blind, and it's like it could latch on to the first like okay result, like this looks promising, let's just filter traffic dynamically towards that. But then in the long run, maybe that would have been like the local maxima versus, if we ran that a bit longer, we could have found something that was a bit more global, like more LTV. Is that where you're kind of learning towards there? Like, can you maybe explain like how that random initialization period could potentially latch on to the first tiny positive signals, and what that could mean?
I mean, any initialization can latch on to the most positive signal, right? Like
Yeah.
that's how these things are defined. And I think you have it right, is there is a set of fixed interventions, and it ultimately allocates the traffic to the intervention that maximizes returns, which is good. But by definition, that is a local optimum, right? Or a local maximum. So the question for these systems is, what is your North Star? if it, in our example, it latches on to, what was a good example that you, I like the dog walk, the dog food gift certificate, maybe. Is that one of the things that you brought?
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking too of like grooming, like pet grooming.
Oh, I love
My
it. Let's use
dogs
that
do
one.
for grooming.
Yeah, I love it. Love it. Dogs always, I mean, my in-laws have a dog. This thing always looks like, 10 days of rain. You get this really increases LTV. You look at your dog, you're much happier. You're willing to causally increases the lever of LTV, because now you buy food there all the time, right? But maybe there is an intervention out there that is even better. You send a dog on a cruise or something like that. I don't know. But how is that system going to know that it should, first of all, how can it dynamically generate new candidates? I think this is a big open question. And then also, what is good enough, right? When it's an unknowable question. You can't know, by definition, the only way to know that something is a global maximum is you have explored all possible different options, which is not feasible, right?
Yeah.
So it's again, I think it's another example of trade-offs, which marketing is full of, and that's why it's such a fascinating field, right? We've had many. I mean, there's trade-off between learning and scaling, or exploration and exploitation, right? There is trade-off between optimizing on local versus always looking for global. There is the fundamental problem of causal inference, which ultimately is a trade-off, right? So this world is full of trade-offs, and that and all the data is there, which makes it so fascinating from an intellectual perspective.
Yeah, it's tricky. Like the downside too is like, finding that global maximum might take forever, and like that's another trade-off there, is the time. And so yeah, it's a really interesting space for sure. You mentioned agentic a couple of times there, so I do want to let you get into that. Like, there's this growing trend. I've seen a lot of companies like, let's let agentic AI loose on our data warehouse. We spent all this time like building the source of truth. Finally, like we've removed silos. Let's just like slap agentic AI on a couple of on our data warehouse. You've actually called this a terrible idea today, and also in the series that you wrote on LinkedIn. Since a warehouse kind of only reflects the company's current status quo, which in some cases may have nothing to do with the causal relationship that you kind of chatted about already. Like, how does having AI train this way risk accelerating potential negative dynamics, like aggressively promoting a product that correlates with high LTV but doesn't actually cause it? Like the dog walking example one there. Maybe chat about like that agentic trap, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you outline is unfortunately a trend, and I think it's lazy thinking.
Yeah.
My hope, and my belief, I think we've all sold into marketing and have been frustrated at times with the position of the marketer.
Right.
But what I try to do here is to give marketers a lot of credit because it's a very it's a very complicated business. My hope is that the market will see this as lazy thinking, and it's risky too. And that was your question, right? So imagine that basically your data warehouse is full of correlations that causally backfire, right? So again, this example of all the high LTV dog food customers go on a walk often, right? But sending the dog walker with their dogs, which maybe you know from a survey or something like that, but sending the gift certificate of a dog walker actually causally backfires because now I think you're way interfering in my private life, right? So this is what these systems would recommend, and there is a good paper out there out of Duke that makes this point in a different in a slightly different way, but it cannot distinguish. If you don't log it, right, it cannot distinguish what is causal and what is correlational. Now, if you put the agentic machinery on top of it, right, we're not talking about this one example getting into production and causally hurting your top line, right? We're talking about millions of examples like that. And that's, I think, the danger with agentic. Agentic can accelerate the things that are good, but it will also accelerate the things that are bad, to be really plain spoken. And it doesn't distinguish between the two if you don't, right? This is why, a more cleanly delineated context graph that delineates between these are causal effects, this is correlational, is, I think, the answer here. And that's complicated to build. But if you don't do something like that, the risk, I think, is disastrous. And I think there's the possible outcome is disastrous. And I think there is other real issues here. One issue, for example, is the lack of auditability. Yeah, I mean, okay, you go to a lane graph and you have an auditability suite, right? I mean, does it answer any of your questions? No. The nice thing about these decisioning systems, about reinforcement learning, is that I can audit them. And that's a bigger point that I have in general. No auditing is perfect, but I can say, hey, at any given point, and you brought it up to, Bayesian multi-arm bandits with Thompson sampling. At any given point, my probability distribution of rewards over arms, of outcomes over arms, looked like this. And I sampled this value, and then I made this decision, right? You can audit it. What agentic AI does, particularly if you let it go wild on decisioning, you can't audit in this way. And if anybody else claims anything else, it's a lie, right? So I do think there is this way for these two different trends to interact with each other, but I've described how I see this. The decisioning element is ultimately done by an explainable algorithm, such as the reinforcement learning techniques that you mentioned. The generation of the initialization, the cold start, the generation of treatments, that can be done by agentic AI if it is done on the correct context. Because otherwise you're back in this world that we described, which is, you're stuck in local optima. You might be stuck in local minima for all I care about, right? Basically all your options backfire and, you're screwed. And we're back in that world. So that's sort of my concern. Without this semantic layer that teaches the machine what is causal and what is not, it'll make up what is and what is not, and you don't want to be in that world.
So where does composability fit into this whole solution here? You mentioned the context graph and how letting agentic loose on the warehouse could be really dangerous. But something else that you wrote was that journeys are causal language. A customer journey is causal language, and AI has to be able to speak that language to be effective. Maybe chat about the concept of composable decisioning, where the model learns in real time as a customer is moving through that journey without data ever leaving the warehouse. Chat about that problem of decoupled learning and execution.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think it's a slightly different point because this goes kind of deep into implementation. And it goes to one thing that certainly I believe should be the standard for enterprise grade. And I think most enterprise companies do understand this as their standard, which is how much can we do without any of our data leaving the system, right? Most decisioning systems are built something like, you take the relevant data out, You train the model, and then you update the model on some sort of cadence that you predefine. Right? When we build this thing, we build it according to our, I think, philosophy on composability. And there is a way, first of all, I'm not a big fan of building products from scratch. That's my bias in my career. I've been there, done that. I've raised close to $6 million, hired really smart people, went into a dark room and built a product. And I think particularly if you come from an academic background, that is sort of the bias. But it doesn't work, and it shouldn't work, right? Because marketing is here and has workflows and jobs to be done. And I think right now this is the journey. I think marketers right now think about their work in terms of journeys and orchestration. Maybe audience building, but orchestration. So there was two big questions. One, as opposed to building a new, Tobi invented, AI decisioning suite.tm, please use it. And, I much rather retrofit existing product that has usage because it addresses pain points of the customers with new capabilities. So that's a philosophical point one. And I think the philosophical point two is, can we do it all in such a way that we still don't have to take any data out? And you mentioned the other point, if I have to take data out, train a model, you have this asymmetry, right? There's the model learning step, which is a whole different pipeline. And then there is the decisioning at time of inference step, and they're disconnected, right? So we basically said, let's try to get to this parallelism of training and traffic allocation all happen seamlessly in the same breath. Essentially, every person who's exposed to this decisioning system will lend intelligence to the system in real time, right? There is parallelism now, and also let's use products that we know are there and use because they address customer pain points or buyer pain points. And that's just my bias to building AI products, because I've been on the other side of this. And, if you ask my investors, the outcome for Occur was not a cursor or you get it.
Yeah, I love the self-reflection there, like getting funding and going in a dark room and building what you think people are just gonna love, and then just like asking people to end up using versus the flip side, and thinking about it as journeys. I think that's totally the right way to go about it. There's a couple more things I wanted to get into, Tobi, but I do want to make time for like the topic of machine decisioning and how it transcends marketing. You wrote about that in some of your posts also, like looking at the bigger picture here. Like you said that machine decisioning is actually way bigger than just marketing. We just talked about the marketing use case here, specifically lifecycle marketers. How do you think shifting from like the human gut feel or intuition to machine decisioning help reduce systemic biases in critical areas like healthcare? You mentioned like hiring. We also have like criminal justice. Unpack that for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's well documented that that human decisioning is biased in foundational ways. I mean, this is the whole or suboptimal, even if it's not biased. Just impacted by noise. This is the whole theory of behavioral economics and Danny Kahneman, right? Who is a Nobel laureate in, I think, the first sort of Nobel laureate in the behavioral economics realm. But it's this idea that humans actually don't behave as rational actors. Right? They can be biased, but there can also be situational factors that influences you. And there is many examples: hiring, firing, right? You had a really good breakfast in the morning, and your kids, you had really nice interaction with your kids, and you meet this candidate who doesn't meet your standards, but you just have you on a good day, right? It's just how the human brain works. I mean, there is nothing to be done about it, right? And then there is bias decisioning as well, and I think their examples abound too. I think if you look at one of my favorite examples is traffic pullovers, right? You bet they're biased, and they're biased by race, and it's provable, right? At least the downstream effect that they're biased. Sentencing. another example you brought up, right? Medical treatment allocation is biased, right? So you have these two big factors that make human decisioning worse. And here's the biggest issue. You can't audit it, right? If you hired, I'm not going to say you as in you, Phil, but if you hired this guy because you had a really good breakfast, or you let this guy go because you had this awful fight with your wife, and I'm sorry, this is reality today. It happens, right? How can you go and say, oh, these decisions are correct or not? Or even forget about that. How can you go and say, here are the bases that led to this decision, and let's revisit them? You can't, because it's encoded in your brain. And your brain doesn't remember, and your brain is not, meant to be a system of record for these things that is auditable. It just doesn't work like this, right? I mean, my brain doesn't work very well. I've been sick for 2 weeks where my brain really didn't work well at all. But the human brains, don't work very well. I think the promise of machine decisioning is, in the very least, the decisioning process becomes auditable.
Yeah.
Whether it's marketing, right? You can go to these systems and say, what did you know at the point you made the decision, and why the frick did you make the decision, with numbers, right? And you can do it for all these different use cases as well. You can do it for sentencing. You can do it for for traffic stops. I think there's actually one interesting factor in here as well, that some of these things have a really, really delayed feedback, reward feedback system, right? Like maybe essentially one of the benchmarks of how successful sentencing is, what is the rate of recriminalization, right? That takes, how long does it take to measure? It depends on your time frame, but it can take years, right? So these systems, and by the way, if that's the case, we think about this in marketing too. It's a different subject. I'm not sure if you want to come back to that, but then you're actually out of the world of multi-armed bandit. You're kind of in the world of these much more unstable systems, Markov decisioning processes, things like that, right? They're just less stable. It's much harder. It's a much harder problem, right? But still, I think that is the potential in human decisioning, in machine decisioning. It also gives me, it gives me some hope, because it is a way to tie agentic AI into something that improves outcomes in a meaningful way. And this is certainly one other, there's these two big streams that I'm really interested in marrying, right? Agentic AI and reinforcement learning. Maybe I'll say two more words on why and where I think agentic AI is a standalone sort of lacks in civilizatory ambition, which is where we opened. To me, and I made the point in a recent conference as well, if you look at the first internet era, so, mid-90s in Silicon Valley, there was this feeling of, we're going to make a lot of money on this, but we're actually going to better the world. If you talk to anybody who was there, there was this civilizatory ambition to make humankind better. And with agentic AI, I haven't seen it at all. It's like a monetization play. It's a bandwagon that you want to jump on, or write something nonsensical on LinkedIn. I remember I was in a panel discussion with a VC who said, "Oh, we figured out agentic AI besides observability." And this guy has no clue what he's talking about. It sounds good. It's sound bites. You just want to be on the bandwagon, but you don't think about implications of this technology, right? And there's obviously all these controversies that I'm not going to get into, because I'm tired of them, like the Claudebot controversy that we've been following. Right? It's funny, but I think it shows there is a void of intellectual voices.
Yeah.
Right? Tying this to auditable decisioning in the way that we described here, I think gives agentic AI a purpose that actually can lead to civilizatory improvement, right? And the last thing that I'll say on this is, I am a skeptic. I think, if you want to take my blanket statement off, if you take agentic AI as a monolith, and you make that statement that it has no civilizatory potential, or no potential to improve civilization, obviously that's too broad, right? And I do, what I miss is intellectual voices, academic voices that accompany that. There was a fantastic paper out there called The Agentic Economy out of Microsoft Research that to me, where it takes agentic AI as a monolith and it describes how agentic economy can reduce income inequality and really lead to a civilizatory improvement. I don't agree with the assumptions of that paper necessarily because I think it is sort of hinging on this idea of equal access, which I think that's to be TB. I'm skeptical on that, but at least it is an intellectual contribution that otherwise I've been missing. To me, though, to kind of close the loop, tying those two things together and saying, we have a auditable pathway to make sure that, forget marketing for a second, that sentencing is more fair, right? Let's do marketing that I can do better experiences for my customers that also increase my top line, right? Win-win, right? Tying that to agentic AI to help with the issues that these systems have, the shortcomings these systems have, I think would give it a place in redefining what can be done in terms of civilizatory improvement.
Such a cool answer. I could listen to you talk about this for a full hour, Toby. We'll link it to the paper that you mentioned there. It sounds super cool. But yeah, I love your answer to ground us back into like, we do marketing for a living, but there's applications that are way bigger than this, and I appreciate that. We got one last question for you, Toby. You're obviously VP of AI, you're an entrepreneur, startup exec, you're a product innovator, but you're also a dad of 2 young girls. One question we ask everyone on the show is, how do you decide what deserves your energy at any given moment, and what's your personal system for staying aligned with what actually makes you happy?
Oh, Phil, that's an easy answer. My girls always deserve my attention. So if there's any question there, that always goes in favor of the girls. Also, I think you can learn a lot from kids, right? Even on the things that we're thinking about, sort of from a philosophical angle, human biases, human noise that leads to suboptimal decision making. Like obviously, we're lost causes, right? We are older, but you see it sort of develop in kids, and it's interesting. But then obviously from a personal perspective, I mean, my girls and my family is the center of my life, and I think about marketing and causal questions and civilizatory improvements for sure. But at the end of the day, we do marketing for internet, and I think that's okay. That's fine. I think it's not net negative, and I think that's probably a good compass to judge that what you want to work on and not. By the way, that's one of my compass. I'm a pragmatist. I do no harm is a good place to start, right? But at the end of the day, it's also marketing for the internet, so our tolerance for error is fairly high, and we're not solving the most recent famine in Central Africa. So
yeah,
it's an easy answer. It goes to my girls.
I love it. Yeah, great grounding answer there. I got a young boy and a young girl, so I totally relate to that. Toby, this has been super fun. I really appreciate your time and prep leading up to this. Tons of insights for folks in there. And well, like we said, we prepped using Notebook here, and we'll share some of the graphs that came out of this. But yeah, really appreciate your time, Toby. This is super fun.
Phil, agreed. Thank you also for your prep and taking the correlation versus causation seriously. I am still thinking about how to communicate this in a way that is digestible. Maybe this was a step towards it, maybe not, but I very much appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, hopefully a nice step towards that for sure.